Hello and welcome back to a special edition of a joint show of Real Seekers with me, Dale the Real Seeker, and I'm joined by
David the Skeptic. Welcome to yet another episode of Skeptics and Seekers. I'm your host, David the Skeptic, and I'm joined by, you know what, this is ridiculous. You lead. It's okay.
Okay. All right. So excellent. So as you can tell, audience, we're doing a joint show. I'm been accepted to the Masters of Philosophy program. So that's starting up in September, and obviously I'm gonna have less time for doing new podcasts. Though I will try to every now and then throw something up there, and I've got the SNS archive to go through for people. But yeah, before that starts in August, I'm trying to go out with a bang, and I wanted to have another conversation with David as a joint show here. And in terms of picking a topic, so I thought it'd be interesting for the audience to know that I've changed my mind on a certain issue, and it's an issue that David and I have spoken about quite a lot, namely the skeptical argument that the book of Genesis, in terms of its creation account, is an error. And in the past, I've been happy to admit on multiple shows, yeah, I think it very probably is an error, and that doesn't affect my Christian faith. However, having looked into it now, I've actually changed my mind on this front, on a balance of probabilities. I don't think the skeptic can prove this is an error.
So what you're saying is you once thought you were wrong, but you were mistaken.
Yes. I was wrong about being wrong. So yes. So exactly. So in terms of this show, there's going to be two elements that I've broken it up to. So I think that there are at least two essential premises or two essential components for a skeptic to be able to prove that, look, Genesis is in fact an error on in terms of God's creating the earth and the solar system, as well possibly with the age of the earth, as opposed, it being 6,000 as opposed to 4.5 billion years old. So those two elements are going to be, number one, obviously the skeptic has to prove, well, what is, factually speaking, what is the age of the earth? And then aspect number two is going to be, well, what does the Bible contradict that? Does the Bible say that it's not designed by God, or that it's not formed naturally, or that it's not 4.5 billion years old and is in fact designed by God and is much younger than that? So, those are the two elements that the skeptic are saying contradict each other. Just before I guess get into my opening case, David, would you agree with me that, yeah, if a skeptic is trying to make this argument, that at least these two elements are essential for the success of that argument?
As much as I've thought about this, I haven't actually thought about that particular question. Intuition says, yeah, I think that's reasonable. If you're saying that the Bible is in error about whatever, the first thing I would actually argue, the first thing you need to show is that the Bible actually said that thing that you said it said.
Yeah.
And then you have to show that the thing that it said is an error. So I think if that's the question, I would have to say yes.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So yeah, I guess we'll get straight into it at this point, and I'll give my opening case as quickly as I can for David's benefit, because I know he doesn't enjoy long intros. So
no, take your time. Actually, this is it's okay.
All right.
Because I think that you have a lot of things in here that people are going to have to maybe listen to a second time or look up, and and so depending on how detailed you get, I think that you would be doing a disservice if you shortcut the information.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Perfect. So the first thing I want to do is I want to look at each of these elements and explain why has Dale changed his mind on this front. So let's take the second element first. So that what does the Bible actually say? Does it actually teach the Earth is young? It's 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Does it actually teach that it's a special creation or a divine design in some respect? And on this front, I don't think we can actually prove. I think I'm only 45% convinced that we can prove that the text of Genesis is actually teaching these things. And the reason I think this on an interpretational level is based on the genre of the text. So I'm going to agree with David. I have always said I thought that the best interpretation of the Genesis text is the literal historical genre. It is literal historical truth, and once you're given that, the days are probably meant to be 24-hour days, and it gives us an age with the genealogies of about 6 to 10,000 years old. I think that is the best explanation given that genre. However, recently I've been convinced that actually Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are not the literal historical genre, in the same way that the rest of Genesis is. It's actually what's called mytho-history. And once you have mytho-history in the mix, well, then you don't take the text literally. You don't have to say, oh, was there a talking snake? How old is the earth? And that sort of thing. So in the first place, what is mytho-history? So mytho-history is a secular scholars have identified this genre of text in ancient Near Eastern literatures. Actually, an Assyriologist whose name is Dr. Thorkild Jacobson, and he was the first to identify this unique genre known as mytho-history based on studying a Babylonian text called the Eridu Genesis. And he identified certain features within the text that are common to other ancient Near Eastern texts that fit this genre. So in the first place, there are mythical elements, right? The flood, creation, the story of the creation of man and how they got their place. In a lot of ancient Near Eastern texts, it's the formation of the kingship over the land and that sort of thing, and how the gods set up the system and that sort of thing. So these are typical things that are part of myths. They're common to ancient Near Eastern myths. But there's a twist, because there's also a historical interest that's been identified, and these are identified in things like the genealogies and these specific king lists and that sort of thing that are evident in these texts. So there's an interest on the part of the author to ground the mythical elements of his story in actual historical figures and genuine historical events, but they couch it in the language of myth and that sort of thing. So that's what the genre is, and it's been identified, as I said, in non-biblical ancient Near Eastern texts. So the question becomes, okay, well, is the Bible actually this genre? And it'll surprise people. Most Old Testament, even evangelical biblical scholars, like Gordon Wenham, for example, they say yes. This is mytho-history. It's not literal history. And as I said, it's important to note that mytho-history is not the same as just pure myth. We're not saying the Bible is just pure made-up myth. It has this historical focus. Adam and Eve were real people. The main essential events like the fall were literal history and that sort of thing. But it's the elements of it, how it tells that story in terms of the details like the snake and the tree and that sort of thing. Those aren't necessarily historical. But how do we identify the Bible as being mytho-history? So in the first place, it fits the form of this literary genre. It deals with the flood. It deals with the creation and formation of mankind from God and that sort of thing. And the rulership over the earth, as well the fall and that sort of thing, the fall of man into this lesser than ideal state from this golden age. But at the same time, it also has genealogies in it. It has lists of kings, the tables of the nations, and that sort of thing. So it shows that the author of Genesis is in fact interested in grounding his work in historical figures and essential historical events, but he's couching it in these common themes of his time. And basically, there are various arguments that scholars give as to why, beyond just the form, why we can identify Genesis as this genre. I'll give the two that were the most convincing to me, because I do think that young Earth creationists can counter most of the reasons given, the specific reasons. The two ones that were decisive for me were the following. So, number one, the talking snake has to be a myth. It cannot be literal history. And the reason for this is just read the text of Genesis itself. It's obvious that the snake is a beast of the field, and it's ascribing mental properties to this beast. First of all, it can talk, but it's also it's the wiliest of all the beasts of the field. And most Christians will try to say, yeah, but that's because it's not a real snake. If you read this literally, it's Satan in the form of a snake, or it's Satan possessing a literal snake or something like this. But that's reading something into the text. If you just read Genesis, it doesn't identify the snake as Satan in any way. There's no explicit association there. There is no mention of a supernatural cause of the snakes talking in any way, but with Balaam's ass, for example, or donkey, for example, in Numbers. The text specifically says the Lord supernaturally opened up, or miraculously opened up, the mouth of the donkey. So there's nothing like this in Genesis. It's just telling it straight up. Hey, there's a snake. The snake was the craftiest of all the beasts that God had created on the earth. He shows up in the garden. He starts talking and convinces Adam and Eve to fall. And as a punishment, the snake, it's the curse on the snake seems to be an ideological description of why do snakes slither on their bellies? Well, God cursed them. So it seems to be that Genesis is talking about a literal snake. However, the mythic part is, I do think that this is symbolic of Satan. So I think that it's history, that Satan was involved in tricking Adam and Eve. He wasn't in the form of a snake or anything like that. In one form or another, he was involved in tricking Adam and Eve to sin. And this is why we get allusions in Revelation, calling Satan the great serpent and that sort of thing, connecting it to this Genesis account. So that's my first reason. My second main reason, and I'll let David come back, we'll address each topic separately, I guess, so it's not talking too long. But the second reason is the cherubim. So after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, God stations angels known as cherubim to guard, with a flaming sword, to guard the tree of life and the tree of, to guard the garden. Humankind, you're separated from God. That's your punishment. And these cherubim are there guarding the garden. Well, cherubim cannot be, on a balanced probabilities, they cannot be real, literal history, because cherubim don't exist. They aren't real beings that exist in heaven. And the reason we get to this that I find convincing is, look, cherubim, the Jews, the second commandment, right? Thou shalt not make any idols on anything in heaven or on earth or in the seas below. Jews were prohibited strictly. I mean, you were killed if you did this. You were killed for picking up sticks, for crying out loud. So if you used idols or images of anything in heaven or earth in the context of worship, that was a death offense. You cannot do that. Only God should be worshipped without the use of any images or anything like that. However, guess what? In the context of worship within the temple, within the Holy of Holies itself, the Ark of the Covenant has images of these cherubim. And most scholars will say, well, isn't this a violation of the second commandment? And the best explanation, in my opinion, is no, because these are not real creatures that exist in heaven or on earth. They're mythical creatures. Cherubim are just mythical creatures. And we know about this from ancient Near Eastern culture. Cherubim are not unique to the Bible. They exist. I've seen them literally in the British Museum. They're huge creatures with lion bodies and eagle's wings and a human head, and they're massive things that guard Assyrian temples, pagan temples, and that sort of thing. And we know in that context, they're definitely mythical creatures. So yeah, that's why I think it's the best explanation. If they were literal creatures that existed in heaven, angels that existed in heaven, they wouldn't be able to represent them in the Holy of Holies as image or idols. And okay, well, if those cherubim are mythical creatures, then that means the story in Genesis of them guarding thing has to be mythical. It can't be literal history because they don't exist. So yeah, I'll leave it there. That for that first aspect of what the text itself says, those are my two reasons as to why I've changed my mind and think that Genesis is in fact mytho-history. So yeah, David, I'll turn it to you. We can go back and forth or give your opening speech on that aspect.
Well, actually, let me just start with mytho-history as a genre.
Okay.
So I don't respect mytho-history as a genre. I'm not suggesting that it's not a genre per se, but it feels like a genre contrived to rescue something rather than a genre that's describing a thing in a better effort to understand it. So I can't speak to the actual origins of the mytho-history genre. I can talk about it in the same way that most people can. I can look up facts on Wikipedia. I can say that it was first discussed by a 19th century expert on literature or what have you. I mean, it's fairly irrelevant though. As a genre, I think it's kind of dishonorable. It's not, for instance, the same as hagiography. I'm sorry, folks. My brain is a little bit slow right now, but it'll click into gear soon, I hope. Hagiography is, in fact, a genre that we can trace and we can kind of see the beginnings of it, and we can watch people do it, and we can understand it, and it makes sense. Mytho-history as a genre doesn't actually make sense at any level, and so I'm not suggesting it's a genre that's created to save the Bible from itself, but it is a kind of a non-standard genre that is recently being used to save the Bible from itself. And so I think both the genre is a little bit not credible, and secondly, the way it's being used is, I think, almost scandalous. So mytho-history as a genre, it's existed for a while, but Christians have insisted that these stories are not myths. Christians don't like terms like creation myth and things like that. And they have for years, for decades, maybe centuries, insisted that this is no part of myth or allegory or anything that's not real. And I think that in this modern age, that's an argument that they simply can't make. But they have to still try to give it some credibility and gravitas of history, even though they know at this point that it's a no-sell if they simply call these stories history. And so mytho-history just seems to be the compromise that they are willing to use to say, these things that are inconsistent and sound funny, that's the mytho part. But, the actual big events that are being described is the history part. On the way of differentiating the mytho from the history, that's also very ad hoc. There is no way to take a look at something that a Christian is called, and by the way, this is a Bill Craig thing who uses this quite a bit. If you're wondering, maybe some of its resurgence and being used in this way. If you look at some of the ways that it's being used, I contend that there is no way to actually parse which part is mytho and which part is history. And I think that tends to be just kind of an ad hoc reading depending on the point that you are trying to emphasize. And I think this is partly why this genre is a bad genre, no matter how it's applied. But I think it's a very desperate genre when applied to the Bible. So let's just take a couple of the examples that Dale gave, so that I can kind of round out the point. So the serpent, for instance, talking, walking serpent. Well, why do we assume that the talking and walking part is mytho? Well, because it's crazy. That's pretty much why I assume it, because there's no evidence that this kind of creature. And the more Christians say that in the modern age, the stupider they sound. And that's so they have to kind of sacrifice that part, but still kind of hang on to but you see, it is true that serpents crawl on their bellies, and there's an enmity between man and woman. I would argue, actually, that's not true either. There is no enmity between humans and serpents. Many humans keep venomous or otherwise deadly serpents as pets. So the enmity is broken. So it just becomes kind of ad hoc to say, well, this element of it is true and this element of it is false. You have no way to distinguish that. Same thing with the cherubim. Well, why do you want to say mytho about the cherubim? Because it's crazy. That's why. Because when you look at other biblical passages, it seems to contradict some of the things that the Bible says. So we must make that part mytho. But what's the real part? Well, maybe there was some barrier to a real Garden of Eden, and we just, invented the cherubim to explain why the barrier is impenetrable and why people can't go into it. It's all very ad hoc. And so I would just say, just given those two examples, the only reason you would call the Mytho-History is because you realize that calling them history causes you to lose credibility. But you're still trying to maintain some credibility for the text so that people don't dismiss it at all. But when you think about it, smashing myth and history together is just oxymoronic. Myths are things that didn't happen. History are things that did happen. And if you're trying to figure out what happened at a given time, you wouldn't start with a genre that starts with mytho. So there has to be a kind of a contrived reason to use this contrived genre the way it's being used in the Bible today.
Yeah. So in the first place, I will agree with you that there are negative connotations with hearing anything to do with myth associated with the Bible, right? And even I mentioned Gordon Wenham. He believes this, for example, but I quoted him in the blog because he's iffy. I don't want to call it mytho-history. Let's call it proto-history. It's the same thing. You're just playing word games. That if you're looking at secular ancient Near Eastern scholarship, the term is mytho-history. Who cares about negative connotations? Is it this? We've given it this label. You can call it the rose petal genre. It doesn't matter what name it has. It's what is that genre, and does it plausibly apply it? So it's I'm not. I've never been one to get caught up in semantics. It shouldn't be mytho-history. Let's call it proto-history. So I just think that's a silly objection. If you're a Christian and you're just objecting to it because of the name, then that's not critical thinking. And
how would you distinguish mytho-history from historical fiction? Because I think the closest, like I said, I wouldn't call it hagiography. I think that's a different literary form. But mytho-history is very much like the modern form of historical fiction to me. Do you see the similarities? What differences do you see?
I think it could be similar. Obviously, with mytho-history, there are very specific forms or types of myths that it pertains to. So it couldn't be like a myth. The stories couldn't be about Harry Potter flying around or something like that. It's got to be related to certain things: creation, establishment of man as the ruler of earth, and the flood. So that's a distinguishing feature. But as far as I know, it would be similar to modern historical fiction. but again, I don't know anything about that modern genre enough
Well,
to.
so here's what I would say about those genres and how I would compare them. The emphasis is on the second word, and so mytho-history presents itself as history, as some form of history. Historical fiction presents itself as some form of fiction. So we don't. The first word is just a modifier of the second word, which is the thing that we're looking at. And I think that in a religious context, people want to make sure that the Bible is viewed as some kind of history, and so mytho-history. Um, and in other literary genres, we want to make sure that the reader understands that this is fiction, things that did not happen. And the reason, so historical fiction, we're not making any claims that the story we're telling is true. What we're saying is we are using, um, real places, people, and events to color this piece of fiction. And so we're gonna talk about these events, surely, but we're not going to talk about what actually happened in these events with these people in these places. So that's going to be kind of a springboard for a fictional story, and I think that's an honest approach. I can live with historical fiction because I don't think that is oxymoronic. You're just saying, well, what kind of fiction is it? Well, it's a kind of fiction that deals with historical events, but it's still fiction. I think mytho-history is an attempt to elevate myth to something else. And it's an attempt to kind of muddy the water. And so you're saying, well, this is still some kind of history. Granted, we're going to use people that didn't exist, places that didn't exist, and things that didn't happen, but we're still going to be telling you a greater truth that you need to know. And I think that's far more problematic than going the other way around.
Yeah, so in terms of the mytho-history, I would just say that that's not you. The skeptic would need to prove, first of all, that motivation is the reason why it's being brought up, and I think that the evidence speaks against it. So forget about the Bible for a second, right? That this is a genre that's been discovered and identified by secular Assyriologists and ancient Near Eastern scholars. So I think in your opening speech, you seem to be sort of questioning the genre itself.
I do.
You do. Okay, so
I mean, I think it's not legitimate, but I also think I don't know enough about the creation of the genre to completely say that it's bogus. So even however genres are created, usually one person says something, they call it a thing, they coin a term, and then other people, if they agree with it, will repeat that and validate it. I mean, it's not like there's a committee that says, okay, let's make a new genre and then start applying it to these things. So it's the process of how genres come about is a little bit more complex than we had a committee and we took a vote. So that said, I would have to know a lot more about the original coiner of the term to know whether I think that it was scandalous or not to use it. But my bigger point is that this is not a term that has been used for scripture. And in fact, it's a term that people like Bill Craig in the past would have said is not true. They would have pushed back on things like this. And I think the only reason you see some Christians using it now is because they recognize that their traditional way of looking at it is in trouble. It's in trouble from major attack from the other side, and so they have to do something, as religion has always done, to adapt and come closer in line with what we know in our modern age. And so now some of these same people who would have killed you if you had called the Bible myth, 20 years ago, are now saying, okay, we can do this thing. We can call it mytho-history. So this is new, and I think it's a very cynical use of a fairly questionable genre.
Okay. So just to respond on the first aspect about the genre in general, for forgetting about the Bible, just to kind of help you, I guess one main identifier, because you brought up what's the difference between mytho-history and myth in a technical scholarly sense, and one of the major differences. So myth has no concern for time or chronological sequence of cause and effect. Mytho-history does. This is a main identifier. It creation, then the fall, then the flood, then blah blah blah. So there's this chronological sequence that it identifies this genre compared to myths, which myths are more concerned about symbolic relevance, and they're more arranged. They're not necessarily arranged in cause and effect order within the ancient Near Eastern myths, and possibly even Greek myths as well. But that's not as relevant to the Bible question. But so that's a major difference there. Is there's that concern, and they couch historical things. So when you identify these genealogy, I think Answers in Genesis and Young Earth Creationists are absolutely right that in pointing to these evidence and saying the author cares about history and the mainstream events and that sort of thing. But yeah, so that would be a distinguishing feature that secular scholars go to identify this genre. But the main question is, you're right. Okay, great. Let me just grant that there is this genre, and there are literature from the ancient Near East that can be identified in that genre as opposed to myth or something like that. Is the Bible mytho-history? It seems like a literal history to me, or something like that. And in the first place, it has these identifying features. So if we're looking at it just in the level of form, it does look. It has genealogies. It has king lists. Tables of nations in Genesis chapter 10. It follows this chronological sequence of cause and effect type sequence. So it does have a historical concern, but yet we can also identify these mythical elements. And it's not so. In terms of the two identifying features that I find convincing, it isn't just the case that, well, they're crazy. The serpent talking and walking, that's just crazy. So therefore, it's got to be myth. What can I use? Mytho-history. Great. Okay, there we go. I've got the best of both worlds, so to speak. Because think about it. In the first place, Balaam's donkey talking. A donkey talking and walking, that's crazy. But I believe it's literal history. I have no problem believing that it's history, even though I don't believe that's the case with the snake. And the difference in that case is what the text itself says, right? The text itself tells us, oh, well, Balaam's donkey talking was a supernatural act. The Lord supernaturally opened up that donkey's mouth to talk. It was a miracle. We don't get that in the Genesis text. Let me just ask you then, if you just read Genesis without preconceived ideas of, well, the snake's got to be Satan, would you come away thinking the story itself is saying this is just a beast of the field? He's a clever beast of the field. He got punished. He lost his legs, and that's why snakes slither around. Like, where do you get Satan or a demon or something like that? Or is there anything in the text that says it was a supernatural act that the snake was talking?
So when we had this conversation last year, I don't know if we had it on mic or off. Sorry about the street cleaner out just outside of my window there. I seem to recall you arguing that the snake was Satan, and I was the one saying, no, there's nothing in this text to associate the serpent with Satan. And so I was wondering why you would change your tune on that, unless you just realize, no, it's too problematic. If you say it's Satan, so it must be this other thing. And so I think that you may have come to the right answer for the wrong reasons, perhaps. But no, I don't. I don't read that story as that's Satan in the garden. I understand that that's a Christian reading of the story. It's not. It's not a Jewish reading of the story. It's not a natural reading of the story. We're not introduced to a character named Satan. That character is never named Satan or referred to as the devil at all. However, that character, we are led to believe, is a real character because that is the character that created the fall. Even in the New Testament, Paul says that it was the woman who was deceived. Well, who deceived the woman? It was a talking serpent.
Yeah.
It wasn't that the woman became weak and did this. No, the woman was deceived. And so you can't take the speech from the serpent and still have the woman deceived by the serpent. And yes, the Bible doesn't say specifically that God made the serpent talk, but I don't think the Bible is required to say that about every fantastical event that happens. Notice in the punishments, even if you say the serpent couldn't talk, you can't deny that the serpent could walk upright because the punishment was, I'm going to immediately take away your ability to walk. And so you're going to have to slither. It just seems a little ad hoc to say, okay, well, the walking was literal, but the talking was non-literal, and so mytho-history.
Okay, yeah. So I have changed because I don't remember saying that it was Satan specifically. So I'm not sure which reference you're giving, but yes, that is traditionally what I've believed, and I've changed on that because just reading the text. The reason I would say that is because I think there are New Testament allusions to this, which imply Satan was the serpent, and it's based on this New Testament evidence that I actually believe it's historical fact. This is the history part of the mytho-history that Adam and Eve fell. Eve was deceived by Satan. The serpent is a symbol within the myth of Genesis. The serpent is a symbol of the literal history of what Satan did. So that's sort of how that would interplay.
Okay, but if
That's
that's the
taken.
history, why not just write that history? Why write a serpent when you know it's actually the devil?
So that's what I'm saying. You can't use that when we're trying to assess, well, what is the genre of Genesis. The author of Genesis didn't knew nothing about the New Testament and that sort of thing. The New Testament authors or that. But there are two answers. So one, we could say that the author didn't know that, oh, Satan was the one that deceived Adam and Eve. He just knew that they were deceived somehow through some character in a vague way. Or I could say he did know that it was in fact Satan that deceived Eve, but he's couching it in this mytho-history genre. That's why he puts trees up, tree of knowledge of good and evil. I think that's a symbolic element as well. I don't think that's literal history.
Why? Why?
So with that, it's harder to prove that, but it's just the nature of what the trees are called. A tree of knowledge, of the knowledge of good and evil.
It's implausible magic. It sounds crazy. I mean,
Yeah.
I know
So
that you wouldn't put it that way, but just trying to be as honest to how I would have thought about these things as a Christian. These are things that we are asked to take a leap of faith on because they don't sound, so you either believe it or you don't believe it. But what you don't do is question the genre of the Bible when it says these things happen, because there are too many verisimilitudes in the story. For those who aren't familiar with that word, a verisimilitude are little details that give a story credibility as truth. And so, um, a boy went to the store to buy milk. Maybe that's a parable. A boy named Joey, who was going to the store because his mother was disabled with cancer, went to buy 2% lactate milk because they were both lactose intolerant. You see the difference between those stories. The second one has lots of verisimilitudes. And so if that story is still fiction, then it's a lie. Because it's those details are put in there to make you believe that this is a real story as opposed to a parable. And so what I'm saying is the story that you're trying to say, well, some of this is myth and some of this is history. There are too many verisimilitudes in a story to just ad hoc say, oh, well, we'll say mytho on these places that are hard to swallow.
Yeah, so that's just not true then. So all of the original audience would have known this. Now we lost the mytho-historical genre, died out uh, before even Jesus came around, right? So it may be you might have an argument. It's a separate argument to say, well, that's confusing for us. How are we today or people in Jesus' day supposed to understand this story? But the original audience and heroes would have hearers would have been able to identify the mytho-history genre. There wouldn't have been that confusion. But that
How do we know that?
separate. That's a separate. Well, how do you know? How do you know that? Because the skeptics making the claim here, you have to prove that they would have interpreted the same way that we do, and they wouldn't have been able to identify mytho-history. And you can't do that. But yeah, so I wanted to admit, yeah, with the tree. Remember, this isn't one of my two things, and the reason is I can see the young Earth creationist perspective. Like, yeah, I believe that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is probably one of the mythic or symbolic elements, but I'm not forcefully putting that forward. Here's my proof. It's only this snake and this cherubim things that I'm putting forward. These push me over the edge, and I say, yeah, I can prove that Genesis is probably mytho-history, and it applies to both the talking and the walking. But yeah, I would just want to say it's not because it's crazy. It's based on what there's nothing crazy about a snake talking anymore. I defended and still would defend a talking donkey. I mean, there's no difference there. I think that was literal history according to the Bible. But in this case, it's what the Bible tells us. It's the positive evidence saying this was a serpent. It wasn't Satan or anything. You agree with me on that. Secondly, the ancient Hebrews weren't idiots. We have 100% knowledge that they knew snakes in nature didn't talk, of their own accord at the very least. So the only way you can take this literally is to say, well, God somehow supernaturally opened up the mouth of the snake. Entirely ad hoc. Of course it's plausible because they did that for the donkey, but that's just you making stuff up and imposing that on the text of Genesis. And given what we know of the mytho-history genre and its existence, I think that's the more plausible explanation for the story of the snake talking and walking in the garden.
But wait a minute. These people were people who thought that God could open up the mouth of any animal and make them talk. So that wouldn't be far-fetched to them at all. And even if they didn't include that detail in the narrative, we know from other narratives that they thought that was absolutely possible. They, like you, don't see anything implausible about a serpent talking. It doesn't just say that the serpent could talk. It says it was the cleverest of all of the creatures in the garden. So it was also intelligent in a way that rivaled human intelligence. So they did apparently believe that this was possible and not implausible. And so, your statement that these people weren't stupid and they knew snakes couldn't talk, I wouldn't say that they were stupid, but they didn't know that snakes couldn't talk.
No, well, they did. They knew that naturally speaking, that snakes weren't intelligent on the level of humans and weren't animals that could talk. They knew this from their experience. You'd have
right. They also knew that snakes didn't walk because they didn't see any walking snakes either. But they thought that this was a special creature, or that this was just the order of creation, and that these things could happen. And after the fall and so forth, they couldn't happen. Right. There's no way though to say, oh, but they didn't think that this would have been plausible, because when I read their other stories, they apparently do think this sort of thing is plausible.
But No, but it's only plausible through a supernatural act or something when it goes against,
Well, but
God
creation is a supernatural act.
or a demon. Well, this is after creation, right? Creation's done, the creation week is done, and then the snake shows up, Genesis 3, for the fall.
Right. And they believe that the snake had features, special features, that current snakes of their time didn't have.
That's true because the snake was walking and that sort of thing. But so they don't believe that the snake was supernaturally caused to walk, to talk, and to have intelligence. The reason we could say this to count that out. How about this reason? So in the first place, the author of the text of Genesis would have mentioned this in the curse. He mentioned the curse of the snake no longer being able to walk and losing that property. Why doesn't he mention his losing his mental intelligence and the property of being able to talk? So I just think it's unlikely that the Genesis author has this in mind. In terms of what you're saying, it seems more likely that your interpretation that it's it's literal history, and the author's saying that snakes had the special property of intelligence and talking prior to the fall. No, it's probably a myth. If it was meant to be literal, then in the same way, the author of the text said the curse, if you're no longer walking, you've lost your legs, now you slither on your belly. In the curse, he would have also said, and you're no longer going to be smart, you're no longer going to be able to talk. So I think that's unlikely. A second reason would be that would make God the author of sin. God is the one making the serpent say what it's saying through a supernatural act, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
And the author,
that's the one that I wanted you to get to, because that's where your argument comes completely full circle, if I dare say. It doesn't make sense to you, because if it were viewed the way I'm viewing it, then it would prove a contradiction in the Bible. And your starting point is there must not be contradictions in the Bible, so it could not be that. And I contend that no, it could just be contradictory, because it's not the same author, for instance, who wrote this story about the serpent and the one who wrote things about Levitical law, some 1,000 years later or whatever. So there's no reason to believe that there weren't contradictory ideas, and this is the same goes for the cherubim. So in the you didn't go into much detail on the show, but I encourage people to read the blog posts, and we both were a little lengthy in the blog posts, but it's a good read. The same thing about the cherubim. You make a theological case for why the cherubim couldn't be real, but theology changes, and people's views of God and the rules of God have changed over generations. And so the earlier people who wrote the book of Genesis and that story with the cherubim in the garden weren't the same people who would have, written some of the other things about the cherubim, and maybe rules about graven images of, heavenly beasts or whatever. So you're ad hoc ruling out that it could be just an honest human contradiction. And so by ruling that out, you're saying, well, it must be this other category.
Yeah, it's not. No, I'm with mainstream scholarship. We know for a historically proven fact that this text was written at a time when they would have known the second commandment and that sort of thing. I think.
But you're assuming their society was monolithic. Even if it was written in the same time, it doesn't mean that it was written by the same people, and they wouldn't have necessarily had that understanding. There's different understandings between the priest cults and the prophet cults, and they had different ideas about how to interact with God. And you see this from the first and second book of Genesis, and throughout Genesis, and the Yahwists and the Elists. There were different cultures around God. And so just to say, no, these guys were always on the same page and never said any contradictory things, is a presupposition that you are using to form your conclusion, that these can't be contradictions. And I challenge the presupposition that you're making.
Yeah, I would just say, well, we know better, right? We know that there were different factions at different times. Israel fell into sin, even the establishment and that sort of thing. But even the identification of these idols as the sin proves that they made this differentiation. They didn't treat the cherubim in the same way. Hey, I put up a new statue of Baal. This is my act of rebellion against the Yahweh cultists or something like that. If you're envisioning all these different groups or something like that, they saw the placement of an idol as the definitive act. We're taking a stand. We're no longer part of this Yahweh thing. This differentiates us. And the cherubim wasn't seen that way. That was part of Orthodox that all the sects were happy with, including the Bible authors who wrote this the second commandment against idolatry, and that they had no
Right,
problem.
but it was actually God directly. If I recall I didn't look this up before the show, but if I recall correctly, it was God directly who ordered the people building the ark or the tabernacle, wherever it was, to put these cherubim on there. It wasn't their idea, and so this was part of God's instruction to do. And it seems like a very odd instruction to do, to say, I want you to put these cherubim on there. But what he's really saying is, oh, but there's no such thing as cherubim.
Well, so cherubim are symbolic, right? This is the mytho part. That myths are generally symbolic. They're symbolic of God's sovereignty, of God's presence. They represent this symbol. And now that you're giving me God in the mix as an explanation, yeah, like, so obviously if the Christian God is true and the Bible is true, then I don't have this historical challenge to worry about conflicting people. We have the biblical authors, and God has to be consistent. He says no idols of anything in heaven or earth, and that would be consistent with his command of making cherubims. And the only explanation for that is if, well, they're not literal creatures. And
no, the other explanation is that wouldn't have been considered an idol. When God said to put this thing on the ark, it's not an idol at that point, and He's not saying you need to worship this thing or what have you. So I think that again, you're letting a theological conclusion be your starting point for figuring out whether this is literal or not. And I think that we have to not jump to the theological conclusion first. In fact, I don't think that the theological conclusion has any place in the literary structure at all. It's either real or it's not real, regardless of what you think the theology was at that time. And if you think that God actually told people to post cherubim on things, and they obviously, if they doesn't matter whether they thought cherubim were real or not, or whether cherubim were real, it's real enough at that point. And when the storyteller of Genesis says, and this cherubim has this flaming sword and he's keeping people out of the story, that has some verisimilitude. I think he was guarding the east entrance or something like that. And, you can say, well, all this breaks down into some kind of symbology somewhere along the line, but the story just doesn't read that way. It's hard for you to say, well, Eden is real and the fall is real, but the cherubim that was sent to guard it, in fact, I don't think it was a cherubim. I think it actually said angel. That's somehow not real. So it seems very ad hoc, and I don't see how you get to some things not being a part of the history part just because they would conflict with theology. I think there are lots of things in the Bible that contradict the theology of other parts of the Bible. That's why we call them contradictions.
So that's interesting, though, because it's the opposite. You're the one that's being ad hoc. You're adding in this non-evidenced assumption that somehow cherubim are the exception to the rule, that you can make images of them, and God is consistent with his second commandment or something like that to give such an order. And I just think on a balance of probabilities, So in the first place, yes, that's possible. Remember, I'm only 55% certain that the mytho-history genre applies to Genesis chapters 1 to 11. There's a lot of room for doubt in there. However, if we're just looking at a balance of probabilities, it's your explanation that, yeah, I know that there's this command, and we know historically the Jews were very against idols. This is what defined them, even in the earliest periods, going back as 1,000 BC. We can prove historically that they had this distinction and that sort of thing, and it defined them as a group versus when they were rebelling and stuff like that. But all of a sudden, but God gave an exception with cherubim, and who are we to question that? You're adding in this ad hoc component that there's some reason they're different from everything else.
Well, yeah, it's not so ad hoc as much as you would have to say that it's not an idol, and they were not told to worship the thing.
It's in the
So
Holy of
that,
Holies, David. It's in the context of worship. Having anything in the context of
but they
worship.
weren't. They didn't worship the ark. They worshipped God. They didn't worship the clothes of the priests, although those were demanded by God too. They didn't worship the temple. They worshiped at the temple. And so I think that you might be using some of your preconceptions to say, well, any image of a cherubim or an angel or whatever is by necessity an idol, in the way that we might say that figurines are used as idols with Catholics. I actually think that what Catholics do with their symbols and things would run amok of laws against idolatry. So I do think that's a different thing. But the whole cherubim thing, I don't think that would run amok of idolatry. But whether I did or not, that's not why that's not why I say the cherubim must be real. And that is why you were saying that they must not be real.
Right.
You were taking your preconceived theology and saying, well, they couldn't break that, so therefore it couldn't be real.
Yes, it is. It is a theological overriding consideration that's what's pushing me over the edge on this example to say, yeah, they are probably not real. They're probably mythical creatures, and it's in the light of the context. We know what cherubim are, and outside of the religion of Judaism, and they're purely mythical creatures in those religions. We
Well,
know
so
that.
are gods.
That's true. Yes, so are gods, but not God. So, um, but yeah, it's you have to come down to making that assessment, and it ultimately revolves around, okay, well, there's this special exception in the case of cherubim, and therefore God commanded it, and it wasn't an issue. And I feel that that's ad hoc on a balance of probabilities. Let me just flip it on you, because remember, it is the skeptic that bears the burden of proof. Can you prove that what you're saying is in fact the case on a balance of probabilities? In the same way, I would actually be comfortable making a claim and saying it probably is mythical based on this theological argument. Could you flip it? Do you think that you can make an argument and say, no, they probably aren't mythical. They probably are literal creatures in some way?
Well, let me answer it this way. I think if we presented this argument that we have both made to a board of literary experts discussing genre, they would side with me that you were doing it wrong by using theology as your guiding principle. If we went before a board of theologians, they would say I'm doing it wrong because I'm ignoring the theology. And I'm speaking of the Bible as literature, and I think that my case is better for cherubims, for the people believing that cherubims was real based on the literature alone.
Okay, I'll just I asked you a question, so would you like me to respond to that with a quick note for the audience, just so
Sure, you can, and after that, I'd like to get on to design and some interesting science that you want to discuss here. So
cool. Okay, so just for a final word, what David said, believe it or not, is actually the opposite. It's modern historians, that ancient Near Eastern historians, that they go way beyond what I do. They use this theological reasoning, and even things that they press, they just make this theological claim: rain. There is no rain. This is one of the reasons they identify Genesis as mytho-history. And I don't use this reason. I think that there is an effective defeater for this, but trust me, they go way beyond what I'm doing in their reasoning. So David's position is at odds with historians, secular historians, non-Christians, non-Jewish, don't care about whether the Bible's true or not. The majority opinion is my opinion, the overwhelming majority opinion, actually. And their reasoning goes way beyond just my two restrained reasons that I think push me over the edge. So yeah, cool.
Well, you did mention rain in your write-up. That might deserve 2 minutes.
Sure. I agree with you. I don't think that reason is convincing, but scholars do.
For those who didn't slog through both of our write-ups, let me just say the one on rain I got a chuckle out of. The idea that, well, these people understood rain, they understood the water table and water cycles, and they had this invented thing called the firmament, keeping waters above and waters below. So surely it must have rained. And so when the Bible says in the days of Noah that it had not rained before, that must be mythical, because they would have known better. And that entire argument is based on what you think they would have known. And I don't know that there is any reason to believe that we would have that they would have known that. Maybe they would have known, maybe they wouldn't have known. It's the type of reasoning used, though, to get there and show, well, and therefore worldwide flood is myth. There are lots of reasons to think that the worldwide flood is wrong. But I don't know that there are lots of reasons that we should believe that the writers thought it was a myth.
Gotcha. I agree with David's conclusion. I don't agree with his reasoning as to that conclusion. So just quickly, we do know historically that ancient Jews and ancient Near East in general at that time, including the Greeks, knew about the water cycle in a basic way. So that part is actually probably true, but it's just, I think that doesn't rule out a literal young Earth creationist understanding. Like you can understand that. You can understand it literally. Like I can't prove that, thinking it didn't rain until after the flood or something like that is ridiculous. Although I will say Answers in Genesis has changed their mind about that, and they're no longer confident about saying that part has to be literal. I don't understand why, but
because it's crazy.
Yeah.
Which is what I said 45 minutes ago.
All right, cool. All right, so let's get into the second aspect that David's dying to get into. So, okay, great. So those that's the first aspect that has to be established. Does the Bible actually teach that the Earth is young and or specially designed, as opposed to formed 4.5 billion years ago through naturalism and naturalistic processes purely without God's involvement, and dating 4.5 billion years? But what are the facts in this matter? And here's where I want to sort of challenge, and I want to kind of find out how skeptics reasoning. So the vast majority of scientists on the planet, and the vast majority, I think the majority of Christians believe, the secular model, the solar nebular hypothesis explains the formation of the planets in our solar system, the sun, as well as our planet Earth. It was a swirling ball of gas, and through natural processes, the sun gas in the center condensed to form the suns, and grains of dust and came together and formed small boulders, and those boulders came together to form meteors, and over time, over billions of years, they formed planetesimals, and those planetesimals eventually became the planets that we have, all through this naturalistic process. And it took 4.5 billion years to form naturally. God didn't need to be involved or anything like that. And previously, I still think that this is most probable given the evidence that we have. Um, However, I do think there are significant doubts that can come into play, and that young Earth creationist scientists do deserve to be taken seriously in questioning this naturalistic assumption and saying, well, maybe God was involved in this instance, or maybe there's actually evidence that the solar system isn't 4.5 billion years old. It's younger than that. And I just wanted to question this second element. In order for the skeptical biblical error argument to work, you have to prove that, well, what are the facts that are inconsistent with what the Bible says, allegedly says? This is an important thing to do, to address. And I think there are some doubts, because when it comes to the solar system, so in the first place, there are different levels that we can ask, right? There's the universe as a whole. I believe it's actually proven beyond reasonable doubt that the universe, as well as the galaxies, are billions of years old. I'm just convinced, based on the evidence that I've seen, and I don't find young Earth creationist counters to this to be convincing, based on time dilation and stuff like that. I lost my place. So, yeah, however, there are lower levels of designs. You can ask, well, is there design at the level of our galaxy cluster? Because there are galaxy clusters out there, right? And we're a part of a galaxy cluster. Is our galaxy uniquely situated within that galaxy cluster? And Hugh Ross, I'll list a source by Hugh Ross that goes into all these different levels and says we're remarkably fine-tuned. Our galaxy is situated within the galaxy cluster, in a remarkably fine-tuned area for not just life, but intelligent life capable of producing advanced technology such as that we have today. That's his specificity. That's what he's specifying. Also, our galaxy, our solar system within the galaxy is uniquely positioned, so that we're able to develop the technology we have, also to even see and discover the universe. If we were any closer to the center, in the first place, we would be exposed to gamma radiation. All life wouldn't exist on Earth. So let alone allowing us to see out and discover the universe or discover the galaxies and stuff, we just wouldn't be able to see beyond a certain point. Telescopes would be useless. If we were further out, we would eventually drift out into the spiral arms of the galaxy, again being exposed to cosmic radiation, all life killed, no advanced technology, blah, blah, blah. So these are different levels, but I want to focus in on the solar system as well as the planet Earth on a astronomy level. And this is where I think some questions have been coming up. So I believe that when we're looking at the planet Earth and geology and history, or all of these evidences, on a balance of probabilities, it does show that the Earth is probably 4.5 billion years old. However, at the level of the solar system, when we look at the Earth from a planetary science perspective, there are some interesting questions. It's not the case that scientists have everything figured out, and it seems like their theories are constantly disproven, and they have to come up with new ad hoc solutions on the spot constantly. And this is what I want to focus on here, is the methodology. At what point does a naturalistic hypothesis for the solar system and the origin of the Earth become ad hoc, and we should favor some kind of creationism? And this is really the heart of what I'm trying to get at, not necessarily proving that they were designed or are old or are young, but yeah. So let me give some examples here. So in the first place, we have Mercury, the closest planet to the sun. So post 2008, we knew that the planet's core was massively, at least 40% made of iron, is what secular astronomers thought. And this is weird. This is physically impossible, given theories of natural theories of how the planet formed. This is just not possible to be the case at that distance from the sun. So, okay, well, what happened? How do astronomers explain this? And they'll come up with a plausible explanation. Well, an asteroid came and maybe it hit Mercury, and all of the lighter elements dispersed from its core, floating off in outer space, leaving behind just the denser, heavier elements in its core. And okay, great. For 30 years, everyone's, oh, we figured it out. We figured this out. It all makes sense. But then new science, in 2008, the Messenger space probe went and observed Mercury and actually took detailed measurements of it. And guess what? This hypothesis or explanation has been scientifically falsified because it has large levels of sulfur and potassium in it. And these are volatile elements. If the impact explanation were true, then there wouldn't be these lighter elements on the planet Mercury. This is a scientifically proven fact, and it presents a mystery, and it shows, there's this element of, okay, well, this explanation has been falsified. Okay, so the question methodologically will be, well, what do we do with that? Does that falsify that Mercury was formed 4.5 billion years ago, or does it just falsify an auxiliary theory? So in science, main theories, whether it's evolution or whatever, are protected or buttressed with auxiliary theories. So you might find a scientific evidence that seemingly falsifies the theory itself. But it doesn't matter what side you're on, whether you're a young Earth creationist or whether you're a naturalist, an atheist. Most of the times when these contradictory evidences come up, we'll just dismiss it and say, well, that's an anomaly and it disproves an auxiliary theory, but we'll protect the main theory by postulating some new ad hoc auxiliary theory. So that's going to be my question in learning from David. When I'm saying these facts, I'm wanting us to think methodologically. Does this disprove an auxiliary theory or the main theory? How do we tell the difference? At what point does the main theory itself have to be abandoned in favor of, well, what's the opposite of naturalism? Creationism, or some sort of supernatural origin or something like that. So, this is kind of the questions that I'm trying to bring up here. There are other things as well, but quickly, okay, so with the Earth, a major question, there are multiple questions on the Earth. You've heard about the magnetic field, and young Earth creationists have had arguments about that. I actually think there are good responses to that from the natural side. But one of the major mysteries, how do we get all this water? Water is 70% of the Earth's surface. It's essential for life. How in the world did the water get here? Because according to this solar nebula hypothesis or nebular hypothesis, that shouldn't be the case. Earth should have been bone dry. These lighter elements could not have formed naturally through those processes originally. And so the majority of scientists say, well, we've got the answer. The water was imported. First, they said by comets, because comets have got water and ice on them, in ice form on them, right? So that's Earth was bombarded after it was formed. It was bombarded by millions of comets, and voila, we've got our water. But then this runs into problems because we've got space probes that have actually studied comets and studied the composition of them. And guess what? Actually, comets couldn't account for the water on Earth because our water is different. Comet water has more deuterium in it, for example. And so scientists have known, okay, well, the comet explanation doesn't seem to work. That's been falsified. Let's come up with another thing. Asteroids, they have water on them. They delivered the thing. And again, once the composition, new scientific evidence says, well, actually, they have the wrong chemical composition as well. And it's been scientifically proven that no more than either 15 or at maximum 50% of Earth's water could have been added through asteroids importing it to the Earth or something like that. Okay, so that would seem to falsify the theory, right? But what naturalists do is the newest explanation I've been able to find is interesting, and they'll say, well, it's not so much about importing water in liquid form or something. It's about getting the elements, hydrogen and oxygen, and they'll say on the primordial Earth, these elements were brought here, and then the rocks melted or something, and then the hydrogen and oxygen combined. So it's literally water explodes from the rocks type thing. This theory is frowned upon by most scientists, but it's the newest thing that's trying to explain this, because asteroids, look, their ratios of xenon to krypton are totally off base. Their osmium isotopes don't match the water on Earth. So the old asteroid and comet thing, which is what majority of scientists believe today, is there are problems with it. And there are also problems with this new theory as well, because it's been there are observations that contradict it. So, okay, the methodological question: what is one to do? We've got this mystery. There are some solutions, and the more they seem to work on the face of it, but then when we study it based on science probes and the latest science, there are these problems that come up. Should we throw away the theory, or is this just a falsification of the auxiliary theories? That's going to be my question for David. A couple other examples. So Jupiter and then Uranus. So Jupiter, first of all, it has certain gases. It has xenon, it has krypton on it, and I think argon as well. And once again, according to the naturalist theory, the main theory predicted, the solar nebular hypothesis, it is physically impossible for these gases to be on the planet Jupiter in the concentrations that they are. They have 3 times as much the amount. And this go to NASA's website. Nobody denies this. This is uncontroversial. Okay, well, how should we explain that? And there is a couple of attempts to explain this. So, number one, they first said, well, maybe asteroids and meteors hit it, and they brought these elements. These elements can only form in what's called the trans-Neptunian object region of space, so beyond Neptune's orbit, where Pluto is and all of that. That's the only place, scientifically speaking, these elements could form. Okay, well, maybe objects brought these elements to it. Well, that doesn't work, because once again, these elements, once they get closer into the sun, they'll heat up, and these elements will be gone. It will not make it to Jupiter to be delivered there. So now the other theory, okay, well, maybe Jupiter formed in the trans-Neptunian thing and then eventually wandered its way into where we are now. And there are certain problems with that theory as well. In terms of dating, I haven't said anything about that. Jupiter's moons. We've recently sent probes to study the moons, and we've learned a lot in the 21st century about these moons. So, for example, Jupiter's moon Callisto is the most cratered object in our solar system. And naturalists will say it's 4 billion years old, and there's very little geologic activity. So all these craters throughout its history stay on its surface. The problem is, so how do they say it's 4 billion years old? They use what's called the crater dating method. They assume uniformitarianism. Well, craters are observed to form at these rates today. We'll assume they've been doing it the same over all of its history. So therefore, we can date Callisto as 4 billion years old. But this crater dating method has been totally falsified. But let's see if David thinks so. Because, so number one, in the first place, there are no craters within or smaller craters. All the craters on Callisto's surface are 0.1 to 100 kilometers in length. But there are no smaller craters. If it was 4 billion years old and there's little to no geological activity on Callisto, where are all these small impact craters? They're just not there, and this is a problem for the naturalist theory. Furthermore, it's been scientifically discovered through studying another one of Jupiter's moons that actually the assumption of uniformitarianism is false when it comes to craters, because what happens is when a thing strikes one of these moons or planets or something, a bunch of debris is sent up, and they crash back down to the surface, creating a whole bunch of other craters. And this was a finding that kind of surprised naturalists, given their theory. They didn't expect so many craters to be formed from the debris of a crashing object, and it calls into question this whole crater dating thing. So again, focusing on the methodology, because I know David isn't a scientist, neither am I. I'm getting this from NASA's website and stuff like that. So, but the methodological question is what's important. These are the facts to date. What do we do with this? Do we throw out the crater dating method? Do we try to come up with some auxiliary theory to try and save it? What should we do methodologically? That's what I'm focused on. Another thing is Saturn's moon, Titan. It has what's called a methane problem. So there's a certain amount of methane, 5% of its atmosphere, which is huge, is methane. The rest is nitrogen. Methane has a short lifespan. The sun will break it down into ethane and some other elements. And as such, it can only last so long. Scientists calculate 10 or at most 100 million years. It cannot be billions of years old, as naturalists believe. This provides a maximum age limit. And okay, eight skeptics are aware of this. The scientists know about this, and they realize it's a problem. It's a mystery, and they've come up with various solutions that have been, in one way or another, falsified. The latest explanation to help David out, because it's about methodology. I'm not trying to get David to refute these facts or something, but the latest theory is, okay, well, we know that it has ice volcanoes, and maybe there's these methane is being produced deep under its surface and is coming into the atmosphere through being replenished in the atmosphere through ice volcanoes. And it's been observed on Earth that in some Scandinavian country, this is happening. There's production of methane within an ice volcano deep under the Earth. So great, there's the answer. But there's a problem there. So number one, it's ad hoc. There's no proof that this is in fact the source of all of the methane in thing. It's just, okay, we need to come up with a just so story to solve this problem. And secondly, there are serious scientific questions as to the self-limiting nature of this methane producing mechanism. And that's where we're at the moment. Is it true that it can form it, or are there self-limiting mechanisms? And that's what young Earth creationists will say, no, there can't be. Scientists will say, well, no, there's differences on Titan compared to Earth, so it could produce it. What do you do with that? Finally, Uranus. This will be the last one. Sorry, David, I'm talking way too long. Is this interesting, or am I boring?
Oh, I have no idea. So don't worry about me. I'm an idiot. I'm pretty sure that there are many people who are fascinated by this. So give them the full frontal dale.
Okay.
We can handle it.
Okay, great. So Uranus, it's a weirdo. It's rotating on the side. Its poles are on the sides. It's unlike any of the other planets. And naturally speaking, the solar nebula or nebular hypothesis, this is physically impossible to be the case. It should be like every other planet, because they all formed in the same elliptical disk, as it's called, and in the same plane. That's why the orbits are all flat virtually, right? They're all in the same orbital plane. They're not, one isn't like way above and way below and stuff like that. They're all in this orbital disk. So Uranus should not be on its side, for example, rotating on its side, but it is. How did that happen? All right, well, naturalists are like, okay, we can solve this problem. An asteroid hit it, a very big one, almost the size of the Earth, and knocked it over. But then through more recent scientific probes, actually that's scientifically falsified. That's impossible to be true. Because, number one, we know that Uranus has a nearly perfect orbit. Only the Earth has something better. So it's about 0.46 in terms of its orbital plane. 0 would be perfect. And okay, and also its moons. The way the orbits of its moons do not align with this impact thing. If it was just truly just an impact, it would be random. It would be not as designed looked, or looking so much designed to be where it is. It would be much more random. It wouldn't be so quote unquote perfect. One scientist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a hardcore atheist. I even had a quote from him saying in one of, this is back in the 2007 era, and he was saying that if there wasn't, if first of all, if we didn't observe the features that Uranus has, no scientist in the world would predict it based on the solar nebular theory. It would take this modern space technology to be able to design that planet to be like it is. Now, obviously, I'm quote mining. He doesn't believe Uranus was designed, but it's just, I'm proving. Look, there is this mystery, and it's a problem, right? That needs to be explained, and it doesn't fit naturally within modern astronomical secular theories. So it's another thing that requires these explanations. So basically it's been scientifically falsified. So what's the most up-to-date theory? So now scientists will say, okay, great. So an impact thesis cannot explain the features of Uranus. How about this? There are rings. Perhaps in the past there were more notable rings, and this somehow caused Uranus to tip over only to a certain degree, I think about 70 degrees. But that's not sufficient to explain its current location. So after that, then an asteroid came, hit it, and knocked it the rest of the way. Totally ad hoc, no proof for this. It's a just so story to save the theory, because otherwise it would be false. And that's where we're at today. But again, even with this impact, I would say, well, there's still this orbital perfection in terms of its orbital plane, and this is still strained, given that even if it's just a partial explanation, the impact is partly to account for this. It seems ad hoc. It seems strained. So what do we do? What does an atheist do with this? Do we abandon theory, or are we open to creation at that point? And it's interesting that Jupiter and Uranus were both said. So one last fact that I find funny. So it's the interplay, the design of the interplay between planets. So Jupiter, remember, in order to account for the facts, Jupiter and Saturn had to be formed beyond Neptune's orbit, out in the TNO region of space. But Uranus and Neptune present problems, so in order for them to be formed, they had to be formed where Jupiter and Saturn are in relation to the Sun now. And then both just happen to magically migrate to their current positions over time. So in the first place, that's totally ad hoc. There's no proof that this happens or can happen or did happen. But also there's this designed interplay, because Uranus's orbit is linked to Jupiter's stability. And as we know, Jupiter's stability in terms of its orbit and taking on asteroids and meteors saves the Earth. Life would be impossible without Jupiter there to protect us from these things. So there's even this interplay. So maybe you come up with an ad hoc thing to explain why Jupiter has this or that. You have come up with an ad hoc explanation as to why Uranus has this or that feature. And let's pretend they're equal. Okay, but then what about the interplay? Because our solar system isn't just Jupiter in isolation, Uranus in isolation. It's Jupiter and Uranus. And you've got to have these mechanisms interconnecting in a way that's plausible. And from what I've seen on the latest research, secular astronomers are nowhere near close to that. There's major issues in terms of incorporating the explanations for the problematic elements or features of the solar system and making them consistent with the other ad hoc components. So yeah, turning it to David, that's my question. Okay, these are the facts to the best of my knowledge at the moment. And I haven't done a fully satisfactory investigation on these facts, but I have looked at both sides. I've went on NASA. I've looked at scientific papers trying to account for some of these features, and I've tried my best to. Here's the problem. Here's what creation would say. Here's what the latest naturalist accounts are for these. Now, what do you do? Is it too much? Is it too strained? Do we hold tight to the naturalist, or can we finally falsify the theory? Over to you, David.
Okay.
How long was that?
It doesn't matter. It's all right. I'll wake up here in a minute. So here's where I would begin. I think, having read this in advance and having had some time to think about my response, I would say that your first duty, if you think that these ideas are even remotely interesting, is to go to a science blog. Physics World might be a good place to start, and suggest them there. See if you can find some people who are science students, majors, even acting scientists to engage with these ideas. I think that watching that interchange would be good. But the one thing I don't see with young Earth creationist science types are debates and or live interactions with scientists. That's hard to find. And so always open to new ideas on things that I don't fully understand. I think the first place to go to would be there. And then secondly, maybe this would be your first stop, just to find Christians like you, Ross, who clearly disagree with you, who are experts in their field. And I think that it's fair to say that you are an enthusiastic amateur on this, which is actually a higher position than most of us, I think. But your next step would be to advance it to someone higher than you on that ladder. Maybe like a Hugh Ross or the billions, or at least billion of Christians who believe that the solar system is old. And so, before maybe trying to overturn a few centuries of science and all of its major disciplines, you might see if you can convince some of the people who already agree with you on the major thing, that there's a God who had something to do with creation, and find out, maybe why because they're not idiots either, so they know about the things that you're talking about. Maybe find out why they don't find it convincing, or maybe you can convince them and shape the course of it. So I would say, maybe primarily or secondary, that's where you should go. I look forward to seeing those exchanges, but right now I am not even qualified to know if the questions you bring up are good questions. So I can only grant you the conversational charity of assuming that they're good questions. Now, for all I know, if you present these to actual working scientists in the field, they would laugh your questions out of the room. They would say, "They're ridiculous questions. What are you talking about?" So I don't know that. I'm just going to charitably say though that they are good questions. They seem like good questions to me. So great. But good questions do not overturn theories. And you are producing good questions, but that doesn't overturn what we know. Also, the things that you are saying, these curious features about the universe, for instance, Uranus being cattywampus on its axis or what have you, while interesting, that doesn't actually challenge the age of the Earth at all. We don't believe that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old because of those things.
Yes.
And so I don't see how those would challenge a theory at all. And your question is methodologically, at what point do I say, well, the theory's in trouble? Well, the theory is in trouble when you bring up good challenges to the actual theory, and you haven't brought any, as near as I can tell. But I would like to take a moment to just read an internet writer on some forum that doesn't matter. I'll put a link in the show notes. I say this, and I never actually put links in, and I'll try to remember to put a link in here. But this is the type of thing that you could read in pretty much any fifth grade science book at this point in every system of education except maybe conservative Christian specialty schools. The Earth formed a persistent solid surface 4.54 billion years ago. Life expanded no less than 3.8 billion years ago. A billion years later, cyanobacteria started producing oxygen as a waste product, and this started precipitating iron dissolved into the oceans in a deposit we now quarry for ore. Half a billion years later, oxygen started to accumulate in the atmosphere, and in another half a billion, rose high enough to trigger an ecological collapse and rebalancing, in which plants and animals came to dominate the biosphere. By half a billion years ago, complex life had spread through the ocean and diversified into all the basic body plants and still exist today, and a lot that don't. Simple swimmers gave rise to armored swimmers, then bony fish, tetrapods, amphibians, reptiles, and dinosaurs, all built on the same basic body shape. Almost all of the Earth's known petroleum was formed less than 160 million years ago. Oil formed before that from bacteria and plankton, but few older deposits have been protected from geologic processes that destroy hydrocarbons. Half of all known reserves are less than 65 million years old. By this time, mammals had appeared, and some were well on their way to evolving into whales. Our lineage split off from the other apes about 5.5 million years ago. We've gone through roughly 20 species since then, through the concept of, though the concept of species is our own invention. Neanderthals appeared in Europe about 250,000 years ago. If they were alive today, they could probably run for Congress. It's not an insult. They might even do better than those now in Congress. That is an insult. When more various groups of humans started domesticating crops and animals between 16,000 and 8,000 years ago, which is why most young Earth wackadoos, his word, not mine, now argue for an Earth around 10,000 years old instead of Usher's increasingly ridiculous 6,000 years old. So I went through this list of things, and you might want to take issue to any of those, but these are things that actually speak to the age of the Earth. There is so much material on the age of the Earth through so many disciplines: geology, chemistry, archaeology. What do you call the people who dig up bones? The bone people. Anyway. Yeah, paleontology. Pretty much every discipline that can speak to the issue at all speaks to a very old Earth in the billions, not even millions, in the billions, definitely not thousands of years. And none of the things that you point to would shake any of the evidences that we actually use to come up with that date. And so what would it take? How much of the type of evidence that you bring up would it be before I start questioning that? An infinite amount, because it's it doesn't matter. That's not, once again, those are not things that make us know how old the Earth is. And I would say that when you start addressing those things, then I would say that you have a case. And if you can start convincing even the people on your side of the aisle that you are right, then you have a case that may be worth listening to people who aren't on the other side of the aisle. Until then, you just have some interesting questions and mysteries that we don't know yet, and we're proposing theories that may or may not work within the natural universe, and we look at them and we test them and we see that that's wrong, and we try to figure out what's right through progressive steps of the evolution of our knowledge. Now, the other thing that I would say to all of this is, yes, there are some things that we thought we knew about the solar system, and it turns out maybe we don't. And so we propose other suggestions. How does proposing God did it help? How is that not just another ad hoc proposition? And the difference is, instead of continuing the conversation and carrying on the research, it just ends the conversation and means that, oh, well, I guess we don't have to look at it anymore because no way nature could have done it. God did it. And I'm not sure how much hubris it actually takes, but it seems like a lot of hubris it takes before you can rule out every conceivable natural possibility and just insert in its place God did it, and so we don't really have to think about it anymore. So I don't see how that helps. So those would be my two responses.
Okay, so I'll start by asking this. So they, in terms of the age of the Earth, yeah. So not everything. I think I only gave one thing that was geared towards that. There are many other facts that young Earth creationists use. You know, like the magnetic field of Mercury proves that it has to be young. This is a young Earth creationist claim, and there could be responses on that. And that's sort of just as there are on the planet Earth. You know, the moon is receding away from the Earth 3.8 centimeters. This is a standard young Earth creationist argument and stuff. So there are other features of our solar system that can be appealed for that. But remember, it's not so much. I'm not the one making the claim trying to prove, hey, the universe is young here. That's not my aim, or even that God designed it. But I understand that the way I wrote the blog, because it's got to be adversarial, I did argue that way to give you something to react to. But remember that my main goal in this was the skeptical argument that there is a Bible error here, that we discussed back in our show, implications of the atrocious passages. And remember, focusing on those two elements. So we discussed the first element, and here's the second element where, okay, the skeptic bears the burden of proof. They have to prove positively that the Earth or the solar system is in fact billions of years old, and I'm trying to bring questions to that, because your answer was, hey, I've got 100% knowledge that is true, that there's no possibility that could be false. The solar nebular hypothesis that scientists give, that fully accounts for it, and it definitely is 4.5 billion years old, meaning it contradicts the Bible. And for this objection, we can assume, yeah, the Bible does teach it's only 6,000. Pretend the Mytho-History thing failed, and it's pretend you succeeded there. You still have to prove this. And I'm trying to put it this way: would you retract that you're actually having 100% knowledge? Like, could there be any room for doubt? Because planetary scientists have been proven over and over again to be wrong. We can't, as laymen, have this. I want to dispel this false notion, oh, the scientists have it all figured out, and look, we know for a fact the solar system formed this way. There's no chance that the Bible could be correct. I want to nip away at that, even if you think it's more probably true. Yeah.
So no, the answer is no. First of all, I don't know that I would categorize my confidence in the age of anything as 100%. All right. So I don't know that I would categorize
myself as 100% of anything to do with aging, but I think that it's a high enough level of confidence so that I don't need to question it at this point. And so I would have to have a reason, a very good reason to question something that we know as well as aging. There are plenty of other things that we don't know well, and I wouldn't have any confidence in those things at all. But there are plenty of things that we do know well. And so once again, of the things that we do know well, I would have to have a reason to go back behind that and question it. And I do not have one. It seems to me the only reason that anyone has expressed for going back and looking behind that is a religious objection. Well, my Bible says this, or my religion says this, or I have to save something about my God. And so, therefore, I am going to propose a young earth as opposed to an old earth. And that seems to be the only motivation I can find for anyone to do that, because the only people who I know of who propose any type of young earth ideology or who tries to cast doubt on the age of the earth are people who have a religious motivation. That in and of itself makes me very suspicious of that entire enterprise. And so I do not share those reasons and motivations. But once again, this is why I say, rather than just dismissing your questions out of turn, what I suggest is that you take these observations to other religious people who think, at least theologically, like you do, but who disagree with you on the science. And I think that that might be an interesting conversation. And so is there any reason why you have not done that yet? And or B, have you done that? And can you point to that resource so that we can look at that?
So yeah, so I think that you're kind of turning it on me. So I will answer, but remember, you're methodologically flawed here. Right? So in the answer, have I looked into it? Yes, the NASA website, Universe Today. I've looked at, I can put them up as sources. So
the question.
Go ahead.
The question isn't whether you've looked into them. I'm not questioning that. The question is whether you have had some engagement with theologians that you respect who disagree with you on this issue.
On those particular issues, from a theologian, no. I've just looked at.
Have you engaged with secular scientists then? Because reading information is not the same as engaging. What scientists have you engaged with on this?
What do you mean by engage? Like email?
Had conversations with or communications with, and presented these things as a challenge and received answers from them. That's what I mean by engage.
Okay, so none. It's all been pure reading. But again, I'm not the one making the claim here. So that's what I mean about, and I'm not done my final research. This isn't an area that I'm as passionate about. I just think, it's a cool question to ask. I'm
right. No, I understand that. But you're asking about my methodological reasoning here. And the method is, there have been many branches, I would say every branch, of research touching on aging that all say the same thing. Okay. And so there is an overwhelming body of science and consensus telling me one thing, and the only people who seem to be trying to tell me another thing are people who are religiously motivated.
Okay, so I'm going to get to that. So I've got those three things listed, but just before we do, just in a short sentence. So on the aging, this seems to be what you really want to focus on the most, but so you said you're not 100%. Great. That's not what you said in the prior show. That wonderful. Where would you say you're at now? Like where?
Well, no, I don't. I mean, I don't think in those terms. I mean, I know that you think in those terms. It doesn't matter whether I'm 100% or 97.14%, or that's not. I am convinced enough so that I am no longer researching the matter.
So it's proven beyond reasonable doubt, you would say. So between 95 and 100. Okay.
Well, it's proven beyond my ability to reason and doubt it. There may be some people smarter than me who can look at the evidence and reasonably doubt it, But I have not seen any conservative religious people who are scientists who have done that, who look at it and doubt it.
Yeah, that's your one of your reasons, right? I'm gonna get to your three specific reasons, but I'm just kind of trying to assess where you are at, because you are a person, you made a claim, I thought, but now you're
Well,
saying, well, I'm 95%, but that's not
yeah, I see. I
warranted.
don't. Once again, I don't really. These percentage numbers don't really mean anything to me. I don't speak in those terms. I would say that I believe that the age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years or thereabouts, as opposed to a handful of thousands of years. How convinced am I of that? Really convinced. So that's.
But are you okay? Put it this way: are you just saying you have because psychological certainty is not enough to make a claim? Like would you go to a Christian and say you're wrong? I'm very convinced you're wrong, and I can.
Well, yes, I am very convinced that you're wrong if you think that the age of the Earth is measured in thousands rather than billions of years.
Okay.
But I am also not a scientist,
Right.
right? So I can't give you the same types of evidences that a scientist would give you, but I can give you the reading material that will help you understand how the scientists in all of the disciplines think. And if you can follow along with that well enough, then I think that the reasonable person would also be convinced by that. But now, if you don't think that scientists who spend their lives studying this are credible sources for this information, and you think that theologians are, then I would say that we have a methodological problem there.
Okay. So that's great. Let me just answer these quickly. Okay, so forgetting about the age, though, what about the second aspect? What about your confidence in the naturalist explanation or formation of the solar system, versus some kind of intelligent design input needing to be there, regardless of who it is or who that designer is? Are you convinced that the secular naturalistic explanation explains the entirety of our solar system?
Yes, to the extent that I can talk about the formation of our solar system at all. You can ask that about the universe or anything like that. What you're saying is, are you convinced that there's no designer who designed the universe versus a designer who did? And so the fact of the matter is, I don't believe in your God, and I don't believe in any God that spoke the universe into existence. And so my certainty of whether it's a naturalistic process or not is in step with my certainty of whether or not there's a God. And once again, that is not spoken in terms of percentages. It's in terms of my conviction of this point, to the degree that I don't feel like I need to look into it any further.
The percentages are helpful ways for me to understand your degree of confidence, because you are able to make a claim based on what you know. Forget about whether you can debate the science or not. Based on what you know at this moment, you said you're convinced. I can claim Christians are wrong in saying the age of the solar system, not the universe, the solar system. And you can also make a claim the solar system wasn't designed. It was purely natural processes through the solar nebular thing. You seem to. I'm
not talking about specific theories here. As far as how the solar system was formed, if the question is that a naturalistic process or a God design process, the answer to that is it's the same percentage that I believe that there's a God. Okay. So I cannot have a different percentage on that. I cannot say that my belief that God doesn't exist is maybe at 95%, but my belief that the solar system was designed by a God is maybe 45%. That wouldn't make any sense.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, how about this? I'll say it this way. How convinced are you that only unintelligent natural processes were involved in the formation of our solar system?
I am a materialist. So again, to the same degree that I am convinced of materialism is the same degree that I can answer that question. Can I be convinced of something besides material? It may be possible. I don't know how it would be done. I think there's a philosophical thing to get over here. I mean, I couldn't be convinced of it with argumentation. You would just have to show me something concrete, and that's something that's not in your purview to do. You can't produce that, or else you'd have produced it. And so by argumentation, could I be convinced that there's something other than material? I don't think so. I believe that I'm probably beyond being convinced by argumentation of something like that. And therefore, if I cannot be convinced by argumentation of something like that, you can't then shake my confidence in that by bringing up some features of the solar system that I don't have answers for. I can raise far more questions about things I don't know than you can. But the things I don't know don't change my confidence in basic things that I have a pretty good grasp of.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. And thank you. That was actually a really helpful answer. Okay, so last question before I start into addressing your main reasons. And I just want to make sure that I'm understanding your position. So would you say, so the reasons that you gave don't actually speak to the nature of the scientific evidence or data itself. Would you say that the scientific evidence and the data plays any role in why you believe that the universe is 4.5 billion years old and that sort of thing, or is it all external reasons, like, oh well, I have scientific consensus, I believe in materialism, I believe that other evidences outside of astronomy, like
it's the scientific data. I think I started with the scientific data. So it's the scientific data is the first level of this. It's not whether I believe there's a God or not. That's not the first level of this at all. When I look at the data, that all of the data in all of the disciplines seems to point to an old naturally forming solar system.
Okay.
So that's first and foremost. Now, are there things we don't know within that set? Sure, but yes. Now we're talking about a synthesis of data from a number of fields, a consensus of people who are experts at looking at that data. So I don't just have to take my layman's word for it when I read over this material. I can see that other people who know what they're talking about and doing also agree. And even the people who disagree with me on the theological questions, most of those agree on the data as well in the interpretation. So I don't have any reason to question the data, but the data is king. It's first and foremost.
Okay. So I would agree with that. I think that's an important step, but I'm just trying to distinguish the explanatory scope. So the explanatory scope of our discussion here with this claim is solely looking at planetary science, the level of planetary science of our solar system and that sort of thing. So it's pointing to historical evidences or geological evidences would be outside of the scope of our discussion. Now, I think you're absolutely right that you need to factor in all the evidences, but I'm just saying that's outside facts. It's outside the limited scope of what we're saying. So I'm just curious, within the scope of astronomy and planetary science and the solar system, are you convinced at all by the evidence there that, number one, the solar system is 4.5 billion years old, and or is solely the result of unintelligent natural processes, or does all your confidence come from other fields of study, geology and history and paleontology and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So we're talking about the data. I don't know why you would artificially limit me to just the solar system data or the astronomical data for the solar system. That seems a little bit artificial to me. So again, I don't really think in those terms. I think that as far as the age of the Earth if we're talking about the Earth itself, we should look at information having to do with the Earth. And I don't think that astronomical data is the strongest evidences of the Earth age. I think that when we look at the Earth itself, we don't have to look up at the sky to find evidence of millions of years of development at the very least. When we do look up at the sky, I don't find anything that contradicts that. But the first place that I would look if I'm aging the Earth is the Earth, not the stars. I'm gonna preference geological data and chemistry data over astronomical observations and whether Uranus is cattywampus.
Interesting. Okay. So I will say methodologically for the audience, I don't agree with you saying you preference. It matters. Do they speak to the hypothesis or not? And they're all equal in that regards. I find, but it's important. You can't just look at one set of evidence alone. You eventually, if you want the truth, you have to look at all of the relevant evidence from the other fields and that sort of thing. But it is proper to have a scope of study. Planetary scientists are not, paleontologists. They're not experts in that field and that sort of thing. But if you want a well-rounded hypothesis, you do have to look at all of that data. I just wanted to know, like, if in isolation within that scope, if there is any evidence at play. So for example, there have been radiometric datings that have dated objects in the solar system to 4.5 billion years old. That would be an evidence in favor of the solar system. And I was just wondering if anything like that played a role, but it seems not for you. It's outside evidences, geology on the Earth. Or
geology is not outside. Geology is as inside as you get. Astronomy is outside. If what you're trying to do is date the Earth. But that said, astrometrical evidence is there too. I can't speak to it maybe as much off the cuff as I would be able to maybe geological or radiometric dating, and even then I would want to take a few hours to cram for the session if I really wanted to talk about that. But let me just ask with regard to the astronomical data, because you seem to be questioning that. Do you know of any non-religious physicists or astronomers who claim that the universe is old in the order of billions of years, but that our solar system is young in the order of thousands of years?
Any secular scientists?
Yes.
No, I know of no one.
So this is a fairly idiosyncratic theory. It doesn't seem to be one embraced by the scientific community, and I honestly am not versed in theories. I've heard many young Earth theories. And those are usually people who are claiming young universe as well as young Earth. So they're not bifurcating the two. And what you are doing is a little bit different. You're giving a nod to old universe in the order of billions of years, but then saying, but maybe our universe is more in our solar system is more like thousands of years. And that's just an idea that I have had no interaction with at any level. So if that is a good theory, I have never heard it expressed by people who express theories about this.
I do think it's an utterly unique thing, and I just want to say this isn't my theory. I actually do believe on a balance of probabilities that the solar system is probably old and that sort of thing. But it's a methodological thing of how we assess the evidence, and you've raised this great point about outside evidence. So I've defined the scope of our study as this planetary level or solar system level, but I actually come to the opposite conclusion when I'm talking paleontology or geology, geoscience. So there's a contradiction there. I think the evidence is more likely that the Earth is old when I'm studying those evidences, when I'm within those spheres of study, and that contradicts with this thing. But we have to put it. That's my point. Is we can put it together and assess these things, and then ask, well, how do they interrelate? Because you can't have. It's not like the Earth could be floating around without the solar system, and for billions of years, they can't be separated. That question is linked in the same way that you can separate the question of the solar system potentially from the origin of the galaxy or the universe. You could, unless you postulate some weird supernatural thing. I don't know, but so yeah. So I agree methodologically. That's a great point. That you need to look at all the evidence. You can have a definable scope, and within the definable scope, the evidence, you could conclude, well, it's more probable that the theory is wrong. But in light of all of the evidence, the wider set of all the relevant evidence that speaks to that hypothesis, overall, it looks like the solar system is old. And I would actually agree with you on that. I believe the solar system, the Earth, is probably old, and by extension, that means the solar system is old. But I think there are reasonable doubts and questioning there. So, all right. So the next major thing is the scientific consensus argument that you give, and I want to take issue with the evidences. I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you mind if I just probe, and I won't respond at all, but with these other evidences from geology and paleontology, you read a quote, you read assertions that these evidences prove the Earth is old. If you're willing, and it doesn't hurt at all, if you're willing to do this, could you maybe just describe 3 of the evidences that you've actually studied, and that from these other fields, that do convince you the Earth is in fact old? And why you don't think
geology, paleontology, radiometric dating. Don't ask me to give a lecture on these, but I've read individual books on these things at different points in my life, and I find the evidence pretty convincing. You have to understand that as a Christian, I was a young earther, a whole 9 yards, and I was convinced that I was wrong about that as a Christian. So this isn't something that changed when I became an atheist. This is something that changed when I was a Christian, and it was a hard change to make. In fact, it was frankly devastating. Yes, things that I found troubling that would be have an effect on my faith are things that I deep dived in as hard as I could, intellectually and academically at the time. So this is one of those things that was very important to my development at that time. And I found answers that I wasn't looking for. I was looking for answers that went the other way. So this wasn't due to some preconceived bias or whatever. This went against my biases. Now, that's some time ago now, and I don't know that I can take a test on it today. I would have to do some cramming. But if you asked me about the areas that I have studied the most that I found convincing, geology, paleontology, chemistry, not as much astronomy.
Okay. All right. That's cool. I'm not going to press beyond. I just wanted to see, because obviously young Earth creationists, everything you just said, they have responses to that in the same way.
Seen them.
So in the same way in astronomy, there are responses to these problems. And I was just trying to get, well, how did you make that leap? I mean, like radiometric dating, standard young Earth creationist response. Well, there's 3 assumptions. They question those 3 assumptions, and the flood plays a role in geology and explaining the various geological features.
Right. But you're forgetting I was a young earther. Okay, at the time of my studies, so I know the young earthers' responses, or at least I knew at the time. I found the study of sciences in these disciplines, though, for myself, to show overwhelmingly that those responses were wrong, empty, and maybe even in some cases dishonest. So once again, not the conclusions that I wanted to come to, but the but you're making an assumption the wrong way around. You're saying, but you should think about the fact that young earthers have responses to this. You're talking to a young earther who started with those responses. It's science that has a response that young earthers aren't really addressing. And so I think that, you don't have to convince me of how the young earther would respond to this stuff. I think that they respond to this stuff in a very dishonorable way.
Gotcha. Okay, and fair's fair. Before I move on to the next thing, I'll give my take, and I'm in the same boat as you. If you press me for specific details, I wouldn't be able to go to the level. Like, I remember studying one issue 10 years ago, up to 12 rounds of response, counter response, response, counter response, and I think that was on the Grand Canyon and how the formation of that. So yeah, absolutely. But my thing, the thing that tipped me finally over, because I think you're wrong. Young Earth creationists are up to date on the science. They respond to the very latest in science. It's just that on the level of geology and that, I find that they very probably don't respond well, because they do have this grand unifying theory. I'm attracted to the hydroplate theory of Walt Brown, which even among young Earth creationists, he's seen as a pariah. Answers in Genesis says, don't believe in that, believe in our thing, catastrophic plate tectonics or something like that. But the thing was, it was this ad hoc element to the creationist responses, because I found that there was too many ad hoc components in order to answer these things, too many non-evidenced just so assumptions or explanations in order to make all of the detailed facts work and fit the flood theory, as opposed to just the secular old Earth model. And that's what sort of tipped the tides for me. And that's what I've been trying to hint at but on the level of the solar system, it's almost like it's becoming the opposite. So yeah, at what point does that scale tip? Maybe I was too premature in rejecting young Earth creationism on the level of geology, or maybe we're not being consistent in the level of astronomy. That's the question that I was trying to raise there.
Yeah, but I just think that it's the same playbook from the young Earth apologists. They're not really that interested in studying the science as a pure art. They're interested in poking holes in established theory, and that's a fairly easy thing to do. You get very frustrated when you're in a conversation and you think the only thing the other person is doing is just trying to poke holes in whatever you say. That's a fairly cheap and easy tactic that doesn't do much to progress conversation. It can help you win debates, but it doesn't progress conversation. And so I don't find that the young Earth scientists are really interested in doing science and coming up with answers. They have their answers, and they're just trying to do a destructive type of questioning that puts everything into doubt. Now, the fact of the matter is science does have answers, good answers for most of the stuff that they've poked at in the past. And so they're just looking for something else to poke at. Okay, here's some astronomy stuff. They don't seem to be as strong in that, so let's poke there. They're not actually offering anything useful to the science of understanding solar system formation, though. And so I do find that a very non-scientific and somewhat reprehensible way to go about it. I have a much easier time listening to the people that are wrestling with hard questions and doing science, rather than people who are simply trying to destroy science so that they can make room for their crackpot theory.
Gotcha. The religion. So that's your third objection. This religious motivation, and in some cases, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Answers in Genesis, they're presuppositionalists. At least Ken Ham is, and Jason Lyle are. And they make no bones about it. Look, we all have a bias, we all have a worldview, and I actually, so in the first place, I actually think that's not a problem. It ultimately comes down to the data and how we interpret that, or how we assess that data, and that's why I like using the inference criteria, and that I've couched this in terms of the ad hoc and the explanatory scope criteria, and that's what's kind of come up here the most. But religious motivations can be useful. I think it's good. I'm glad that young Earth creationists are out there, even if they're totally wrong, and they're thinking outside of the box. And I think that religious motivations and even anti-religious motivations can be helpful, and allow us to see things from a different perspective and learn new evidence in the first place. I mean, Charles Darwin went out and got new evidence for evolution, and that was something that destroyed it. We learned something as a result. Or, there are atheist scientists in the 20th century desperate to prove evolution that caused them to lie and fudge the data at times with the Piltdown Man or something. But nonetheless, their bias gave us some credible scientific facts. They did find legitimate findings, and that contributed to our understanding. How, now we can look, what is the data, how do we assess that data, and that's fundamentally what matters the most to me. It's only once, if you can prove that a religious or anti-religious a motivation, whether it's religious or not, if someone's motivation, their pet theories or worldview is contaminating the evidence, like with Piltdown Man, that was forged evidence, then I have a problem with it. But I do also just want to, even though I do disagree with what you're doing. It is not that young Earth creation, that's a sort of a straw man. They don't just poke holes in theories. They actually propose their own models. They make predictions that have been proven to be true. Russ Humphreys, someone I disagree fundamentally with. He has a white hole cosmology, cosmological model that proves the universe, not the solar system. The universe is 6,000 years old. I disagree with his model, but what the heck was I going to say there? I lost my.
You think that he is doing legitimate science or something like that?
Yes, that he is engaging with legitimate science and contributing. He published his work in a peer-reviewed paper. Walt Brown, he hasn't contributed to peer-reviewed papers. This is one of a criticism of him that I think is true, but nonetheless, his hydroplate theory, he makes scientific predictions in advance, and it's been published for free on his website, and they're confirmed. A lot of times his predictions turn out to be right, and they're in contrast to what the secular scientists of the day said would be predicted or we should find, and he turned out to be right. So they are putting their money where their mouth is, and sometimes some of their predictions are falsified. That has to be mentioned as well. It's not like the creationists are always perfect any more than secular scientists, but I would disagree with you. It's not a fair criticism to say young Earth creationists, love them or hate them, they are contributing some kind of positive contribution.
Well, I might disagree with you about the level of contribution they contribute. I mean, there's always going to be the exception to rules. There, I'm sure, are flat earthers who have published in peer-reviewed papers. Surely, at least one of them has gotten through. That doesn't mean that they are doing legitimate science. And so I think that young earthers are kind of in that camp. And, if you play around with beakers long enough, you might come up with something that someone can use. But if you start your research with illegitimate biases, I have no faith that you're going to get to the end of your conclusions without biases. And so I don't know when we should expect those biases to go away. I think that the biases go all the way through how we set up the experiments, the things that we expect, how we interpret what we see. It's everything.
Yeah.
And you and I are not in a position to do those experiments ourselves. We have to depend on the integrity of the scientists who are doing that. And whether it's a pro-religious or anti-religious bias, I throw those results out of hand. I don't have any more patience for anti-religious scientists who only are doing something to try to disprove a God. I think we can throw both of those extremes out and just look at, make judgments about who is doing the purest kind of science, not whether they're a Christian or not, but who is doing the purest kind of science for the right reasons and with as few, motivational pressures as possible toward bias. And we can get a large enough sample of those people, and that's where consensus comes in. And so if we just took, our 2 or 3 favorite scientists, we would still have the bias problem. But when you look at the hundreds of published works in the consensus of hundreds, if not thousands of scientists on a given subject, then you have a way of filtering that out. Think of it a little bit like Yelp reviews or Amazon reviews. If you see a product and it has 12 reviews, forget about it. Even if they're honest, they're not shills for the company. It's not enough, and you can't know. Maybe 7 of them are extremely biased. It's not a sample size that you can work with. But if you've got 40,000 reviews, there's not enough bias in the world that can ultimately sway the 3.5 or 4.0 review number that you get there when you've got that many reviews. And so the consensus makes a difference in this scientific endeavor. So the first thing we do is we try to use our own intellect to understand as much of this stuff as we can. And then we try to, with the scientists that we choose to read, the books that we buy, the blog posts we try to land on the ones that we think are the most honest and have the fewest bias pressures toward their opinions. And finally, we look at the broader community, and we can kind of begin to trust the handful of scientists we've chosen when the broader community tends to be the same as their opinions. But when you've got these outliers who have strong biases, and then they've got these unique opinions to try to poke holes in the consensus, you don't have real science being done. You might can say that, well, accidentally along the way, something was beneficial there, but that is not the process that we should use methodologically for choosing the people whose opinion we will trust in areas that we cannot fully understand by ourselves.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I fully agree with what you're saying. So on this point, it's crucial to look at both sides. I mean, I've got it when I was looking up this stuff, and as I said, I don't want to. Please don't think my study is insufficient. I'm not writing up a teleological argument. I'm going to get into this full scale probably in a couple of years once I'm going to do the cosmological, then the moral argument, then or either the argument of consciousness or the ontological, or vice versa, and then I might get into the teleological argument. That's a couple of years away, but I definitely will look full scale at that time. I haven't done so yet, but I do constantly, before I give something, I try my best with whatever time scale I had, which was about a week. I don't know when I reached out to you to do this show. So my entire study came about within that week. And I looked at the young earth creationist side, but I've got Talk Origins right there. I love the website Talk Origins. Sometimes it's a little outdated, but it's great. They respond to specific claims. You got your point, counterpoint. And then, sometimes you'll get a contradiction because it's outdated or something. So, okay, I went to a neutral source. I went to NASA's website. Tell me about these space missions, or the ESA, European Space Agency. What did you guys find in your probes? And, okay, it turns out the young earth creationists are right, or turns out Talk Origins are right and stuff. Like, first you establish the facts by looking at various sources and then applying a proper methodology to assess these claims. So I think we're fully on board. The most biased person on the earth, I don't care if you present something and I can determine it is in fact a fact, and I know how to assess facts for myself through a proper methodology. Yeah, you could be the most biased atheist. Richard Dawkins is the most biased anti-theist in the world. He's got a lot of great facts in his show, The Greatest Show on Earth, in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth. I can't take that away from him, you know. All right, cool. Scientific consensus, though. This is your last point, and I do want to challenge this. We're probably not going to agree on this. I think scientific consensuses are practically worthless. The only thing they're good for is as an initial evidence. Okay, well, where do the experts lie as an initial factor of going? Okay, there's probably some good evidence here to look into, but if that's your whole basis for believing something, if that's your pretend that's your only claim, or then you didn't have the other evidences, or something like that, and or materialism, art philosophical arguments for materialism. All you had was the scientific consensus says this. It's been proven over and over again. The scientific consensus, even within this particular scope, has been wrong over and over and over again. It's to the point where it's very weak evidence of anything, in my opinion. It just says there's probably something to see here, but go and look at it for yourself. Find out what those facts are. Don't just follow, well, the scientific consensus is the solar system is old, I'll just believe that. I don't think that is a good reason to believe something, especially when we've seen the scientific consensus in this particular field is repeatedly wrong and having to reformulate. They don't know what they're talking about in a lot of cases. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably not the healthiest way to look at scientific consensus, though. So just for the sake of explaining this point, let me change the focus to medical consensus.
Okay.
Because I've had a lot of experience with doctors. So if you think that you've got something wrong with you, you think there might be a problem, and you could think that for a number of reasons. You might be a hypochondriac. You always think you've got a problem. One of the first things available to you these days is the internet. You can actually, there's actually enough information at layman's level so that you can begin to look things up. What people with these symptoms, who've had these same complaints, what's been their problem. So you can begin to look that up, and you can, find some terms and some potential diagnoses, and then you can maybe look deeper and find some medical journals and read those, and start to form some opinion around that. But here's the problem: you're not a doctor. And I don't care how much internet reading you do, you are not going to earn an MD from that. So you have to recognize the limits, your own limits of being able to understand things that are outside of your specialty. So if you do not recognize that, you're just going to be in trouble. And if you're one of those people who diagnoses themselves and believes your diagnosis over any other medical expert's diagnosis, just go ahead and buy your funeral plot now, because you are going to need it much sooner than you think. You are a fool, and that's fine. World's full of fools. Not illegal to be a fool, but I'm just saying that person I can pretty much dismiss as a fool if they are trying to do all of their research and decide for themselves things that require expertise that they do not have. So that's where you have to move on to actually seeing a doctor. All right. So you're not going to see all the doctors. You can't see all the doctors. That's crazy. But you're going to have to, within the area that you have, and within the people who take your insurance, and then within the people whose bio picture that you like, you're going to have to narrow it down and choose your champion. And you might have one or two others that you might use as a second and third opinion, but you're going to have to narrow the scope of who you see and who you trust. Well, once again, you're only seeing, let's be realistic, one doctor. Most people don't see two doctors or get a second opinion. You're going to see one doctor that you semi-randomly chose, and that's going to be your medical opinion. Now, is that a good sampling of all of the knowledge of medical expertise? No, it really isn't. But it's a better opinion than yours because at least now this is a person with some medical expertise. And you might say, well, that doctor disagrees with my diagnosis. Well, again, you are a fool, and I'm done talking to you. But there is still room to say, there are a lot of opinions on this, and I'm just not sure. And so, what is the next level you can go to from seeing a doctor? You can look a little bit deeper and find medical consensus on a thing. And once again, this is a lot of doctors who are in this specialty, who are outside of your area, who maybe your insurance wouldn't pay for, but you have a way of kind of polling them and using the expertise of doctors outside of your system to get a better answer than what you could come up with, and possibly even better than what your individual doctor can come up with. And that's kind of the hierarchy of how we figure out difficult things that are outside of our expertise that we cannot ourselves fully understand. Now, that's fairly straightforward. And this is kind of the system that people use in figuring out their medical issues. And when they tend to go outside of that, let's say Steve Jobs, for instance, in his form of very curable cancer, Steve Jobs died a fool. Steve Jobs actually, I like Steve Jobs, don't get me wrong, but Steve Jobs had a curable kind of cancer, and if he had taken a more traditional type of treatment, he could be alive today. But Steve Jobs, being who he was, went out on his own, and I'm hoping that he was rich enough, and there were enough people in his life where he had some funeral arrangements in advance, and so he's exactly the kind of fool that I'm describing. Now, if we just move all of that knowledge that we've gained back to scientific knowledge, it is truly the exact same thing, because we're talking about things that are, as a layman, outside of our area of specialty, that require specialty to fully understand. And so if we want to ask a question like, what is the age of the universe? We can do our own research and try that. It looks pretty old, or it looks pretty young. It seems intuitive to me. I picked up some rocks outside. They looked kind of, I'm going to say it's 5,000 years. But then maybe you find one or two people who seem to know a little bit more about aging. Maybe you like Richard Dawkins. Maybe you like the sound of his voice. Maybe you like, Stephen Hawking. Maybe there are one or two that you trust, and you look at what they have to say, and you recognize, wait a minute, they're saying something that's radically different than what I observed by looking at the rocks in my backyard. Well, what do professional rock looker-atters think? Instead of polling two or three, let's see if I can poll 1,000 of these guys. Now, what do they think? Well, it seems like 79% of these cats think, who are looking at the same rocks, and actually more rarefied rocks, are coming up with a similar answer to each other. This is now information that you cannot reasonably ignore. Is the doctor wrong? Sometimes, yes. Is the consensus of medical science wrong sometimes? Absolutely. People die. No, you should not eat bread as a food group every day. That's stupid. We know better.
Oh man!
Will an apple a day really keep the doctor away? No, it won't. But if you were looking at the overall medical advice and consensus of using the best medical knowledge that we have on the planet right now, your chances of surviving past 80 are much better than if you go it alone. And the same is true with our scientists. Are you going to get some wrong answers that need to be adjusted over time? Yes, you will. But you will be much closer to right by going with the consensus than by looking at rocks by yourself and weighing them and trying to figure out how old the universe is.
That is fascinating. So you've managed to change my mind a little bit. I think that's a great point. You're absolutely right. The scientific consensus thing isn't worthless. It could potentially be used to push someone over into believing something. And that example of the medical thing is true, but I will qualify with this: it depends on the nature of that consensus. I wouldn't say it's the same in all fields. In fact, you agree with me. You think theology is just a non-field, so who cares what the expert consensus is
Yeah, but
there?
we can go with history. I disagree with experts in history, and I'm not an expert historian by any means. But I think that, for instance, the criteria of embarrassment is a wrong criteria. I think that that's bad. Now, other historians do agree. Other historians, as if I were one of them, historians do agree with that. So that is not a completely idiosyncratic idea. But enough historians use that criteria so that it is a legitimate criteria for that field. I happen to disagree that it should be a legitimate criteria. And if I'm going to disagree with a consensus, even if it's a smaller consensus, maybe 52%, still a consensus. If I'm going to disagree with that, I'm going to have really good reasons to do it. And I'm going to have to be able to make a very strong case and still have enough humility to recognize that I might be wrong. But yeah, I'm not saying that you should never disagree with the consensus, but if you're going to do that, you will have done an awful lot of research, and you're going to have a really good reason to think that most of the other guys are idiots.
Yeah, it depends, right? So yeah, so I agree that Jesus mythicist is a great example, right? So you have to assess. You're a Jesus mythicist. The vast majority of historians will say that's ridiculous, whether they're atheists or not. I actually don't agree with saying, oh, dismissing mythicists as ridiculous. I think that laymen can have a sufficient degree of knowledge through layman resources, as long as you're a real seeker. Look, you've looked at a sufficient amount to know it's there. I don't think it has to be overwhelming like you're saying, but I think laymen have at their fingertips a sufficient amount of data to make an informed decision, even if that goes against a consensus on that matter. With the medical field, I think I would agree with you there that I would probably side with the medical consensus because they've a proven track record in that field of being reliable in general in terms of the consensus opinion. I might be a little bit more iffy on coronavirus. It's new. The researchers are learning new things about that. I wouldn't automatically assume, they flip-flop. They tell you to wear masks one time, then they tell you not to wear masks, then they tell you things. So there are a bunch of issues that can get involved.
Right. And let me just say on the coronavirus, I agree with you. I think that this is one of those areas, though, where there is some consensus starting to be developed over time. Earlier on, it was more all over the map.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons that it was okay to question the consensus, especially early on, is because good science wasn't being done. And we could watch it in real time, and we could say, look, that's not good science. You didn't come about that by the regular methods. And in fact, I would say that I'm not going to trust any vaccine that comes out first either, because we are rushing through this process of trying to find a cure, and we're skipping steps left and right and shortcutting the process. There is a reason the process is the process, and by shortcutting it or going faster, either you're saying, well, then the process is stupid and we should be able to do this for all medicines, or you're just admitting that you're doing a bad job at good science.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there, that would be the cap. You have to do some kind of assessment of the field and its ability for the consensus to come to reliable conditions. And just the last example, the field of cosmology. That's what I'm studying hardcore right now. It's not the solar system stuff. That was just sort of a bonus that I thought about. But the field of cosmology. I am not a cosmologist. Dear goodness, David, your eyes glazed over when I was going over those basic planetary facts. that's me with cosmos. I do not understand the mathematics behind it. I don't care about the mathematics. I just assume, hey, if I just follow the consensus. If you guys say this works mathematically, I believe you. I don't understand the formula. I don't care. I just believe you, unless I find someone contradicts it or something. But yeah, that's a limit to me. I'm trying my best, but I'm limited. No matter what I do, I'm not going to be able to understand it at that level. I can understand it at a sufficient level to make an understanding on a, like, okay, what is the model? What is it alleged to do? What are certain problems with the model? How do you respond to those models? I mean, Skydive Phil, thank you so much for those videos. He responds to he has the experts themselves responding to the objections, and that's odd for the most part. You just find them, here's my theory and here's my model, and that's it. So his videos have been really helpful in seeing potential responses and that. So with that, I have an inherent limit. No matter what I think, I will only ever be able to be 70% convinced that in terms of the universe, did it begin to exist or is it eternal? Even with all of the things, I've put a self-imposed limit based on my. First of all, there's limits in the field of cosmology because
Right.
there's stuff we don't know. But there's also my own internal limits of my understanding of what we even do know. So at most, I'm only ever going to be 70% convinced that the universe began to exist, and it's just these are my limits. I tried my best. I was a real seeker, but if you put a mathematical formula in front of me, I'll just, all right, I'm going home. See you later.
Right, but you see, this is I can respect all of that, and I don't disagree with that at all. So getting around to back around to methodology here. One of the reasons I dismiss young Earth creationist type science people is it's not because I'm saying I know more science than they do. And it's not merely because they disagree with the consensus. Now, I say merely, that's a big thing, but that's not it either. I then have to evaluate, well, I've got this, the whole crowd is going straight and this guy turned left. Did the whole marching band miss a turn? So then I've got to see then, well, the marching band is being led by the conductor, and the conductor has a map. So why did this guy turn left? Well, he turned left because he heard a voice in his head saying the answer is left. So without knowing anything else that he says, I can say, you know what, that's a bad reason to stray from consensus. I'm not really listening to you at this point. And so in realistic terms, someone like a Behe, I know you respect him, so I'm not trying to run him down. That's just the name that's easy to come to mind. I could also say Ross, but he's not a young earther. He's crazy for other reasons. But somebody like that, if I'm not ignoring them out of hand because they strayed from the consensus. But when I've learned that, okay, the reason they've strayed from consensus is because God, and they have a particular view of the Bible that itself may be questionable, and this is the thing that's taking them in the other direction. I don't have time for that. That is a bad reason, and if that's your motivation for doing your science, you're a bad scientist. And even if you happen upon the right answer every now and then, I don't trust you because I don't know enough about the science to know whether you're right and everybody else is wrong or not. But if you give me a good science reason for you straying from the consensus that I can follow, sure, I will take that into consideration. But if your reason is because you heard voices in your head, screw you. I don't have the bandwidth for that. And so, when I stray from the consensus on a number of things, like mythicism, for instance, I think that I can make a solid case for why I think the consensus is wrong. And it's not because I don't like Jesus, because I prefer as an activist atheist for Jesus to be real. My arguments my anti-Jesus arguments are much better than mythicist arguments. I have much more fun talking about Jesus as a real person and talking about things that he actually said and did, as opposed to saying, yeah, but he didn't really exist. So I would much rather not be a mythicist. I'm a reluctant mythicist. But I think I have good reasons for distrusting people in the field. I might be wrong, and I don't mind having the label of kook pinned on me. And I'm certainly not going to put myself up as an expert that someone else should listen to. All I can do is make my best case, and they can determine that. But that's the position you're in when you walk away from the consensus if you don't have a good reason, and then your evidence just looks like it's supporting the bias, the idiosyncratic bias that you had. That just, all of that spells bad science. I don't even need to look at your results to know that you're not the guy I'm going to follow.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, that's actually pretty helpful. And it makes sense too in terms of their evidences, because earlier you were saying the evidence from paleontology, geology is more important than the astronomy, and I kind of rebutted that, but maybe it's not. Maybe I need to assess the significant, do we have a sufficient amount? Because astronomy, planetary science, we know a lot less about the solar system than we do here on the Earth, where we're able to study it over and over again and that sort of thing. So maybe you are right, that one type of evidence is more significant in terms of proving the hypothesis. So yeah, that's an important methodological thing that people should be aware of. Do we have a sufficient amount of evidence to in one field versus another to overturn that field, or is our degree of confidence in terms of the significance of the evidence higher or lower relative to another field? So that's actually helpful. That's something that I think should be considered if you're going to be deciding, is the solar system designed, or is it 6,000 years old or something like that? So
yeah. Unfortunately, I think we'll have to call it there, and we didn't actually talk about design. So in my blog post, I know that you did not talk about design. You're the originator of this blog post. You're the one who wanted to do this podcast. And so I follow that lead, but I was hoping to actually talk about design too. So I included some things about design in my post that you did not include yours. And so people who want to follow that, read my blog post, and I recognize that even though I responded to things that were in Dale's blog post, I did expand the scope of it to include that. And so if you want to have some discussion online with me about that, you can. It'll be in my blog post, but it was not a part of the conversation that was originally put forth. I just thought that if we're going to have this discussion, and part of your proof is design versus natural, that we could get into design. So I know that you are very busy. Maybe at some point over the next few weeks, you can carve out an hour or two, and we can talk design a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's so I've got next week is very busy. I've got 3 guest shows.
Well, I have no shows to announce. There is a possible roundtable. I think that's going to happen. Marvin and I will make a second appearance, but we will bring friends who will do battle on our behalf while we laugh and watch the bloodshed.
Is the Marvin thing up now? Just because I'm going to go listen.
Not yet.
Oh.
I just finished it last night, and I want to just apologize for any audio issues you hear with it. I had trouble with my setup last night, and so bad things happen. Apologies. Technically, my season is over, and so all of this is just bonus stuff anyway. I'm not using my regular setup, but it'll be posted probably simultaneous with this one, maybe a hair before. But so that roundtable, that'll come up pretty soon. I don't know who all the players will be, so I don't have a time frame, but it'll be soon. And I think any other shows I have in the works is just going to have to wait until the official start of season 3, which is, I would normally say season 3 starts around the time that American football kicks off. But I don't know what sports is like anymore. Sports is weird. So that's no longer a reliable time frame to
Yeah.
use. So instead, we'll say maybe around mid-September.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, have a great week to those in my audience, as well as to those from SNS, some old friends there. Have a great week.
All right. Bye-bye.